So let's now get into introducing our speaker for today. Sam Drummond has had a career in media, politics, and law. Growing up in regional Victoria, he was diagnosed with a form of dwarfism at a young age. Getting into the workforce wasn't an easy task, as Sam found that when they saw him in person, employers weren't so keen. Sam now specialises in the area of discrimination and human rights law, and recently released his memoir called Broke. I'll leave it to Sam to tell us the stories about what led him here. It is with pleasure that I welcome our speaker, Sam Drummond.
Thanks very much, Jess. And it's great work on the introduction. I too want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that to the lands that you're all on today. And really just want to start off by acknowledging that First Nations people with disability face greater discrimination on just about every indicator of well-being that we take, and employment's no exception. So I want to recommit myself, as I do every day, on working to address that entrenched discrimination that we see in the employment space and in the broader community. Disability activist Stella Young famously said, "I'm not your inspiration." So I wanted to just get that clear, that I'm not here today to inspire. I'm not going to give you the inspiration to feel good about yourself. I'm not going to tell you about an inspirational journey. I'm just going to tell you about a journey. That's my journey, and it's nothing more and nothing less. And it's a journey like just about everyone here has had too. We all have our own story to tell. My employment journey started well before I got my first job. And in fact, it started as far back as I can remember. And I think it's important for me in doing something that is online to not hide behind our online functions, because and hopefully you can see my face that's not a video face here, but with the transition to video, I've found that I can pretty much come across without revealing my disability, unless I'm in person. So this was me as a kid in my teenage years, just starting that journey, I guess, of looking for jobs. I have dwarfism. It impacts the way that my legs grew and the health of my joints. It required a series of surgeries as a kid. I was in a wheelchair for a fair chunk of my childhood, and will possibly be in a wheelchair in the future, and I'm really proud of that. I didn't grow up with anyone else with dwarfism. My family were tall, my friends were tall, the community around me was tall. So I took many of my cues of my place in the world, including what sort of jobs were for me, from what was on my television screen. One of the first films I saw was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And as magical as the world created by Willy Wonka was, I couldn't help shake the feeling that those short-statured Oompa Loompas was to be my lot in life. Over the other side of the river, beholden to an eccentric businessman who thought he was looking after these odd creatures, but without being clear whether they were paid or whether they ever stopped working for a rest. Then later came Austin Powers and the advent of Mini-Me. The calls from strangers out of passing car windows has followed me in the decades that have come. And again, this is a strange character who took his cues from a wacky boss with a savior complex. In real life, when I was about this age, we used to get our stationery from a local store in our small country town. People with disabilities were working behind the scenes. It's what my family called a sheltered workshop. It's a disability enterprise. And here, people with disabilities had work and formed community. But I was horrified when I found out that these people were judged on capability and paid that proportion of minimum wage. Was I worth a fraction of other people? And in real life, I told a school careers counsellor at my public school that I wanted to be a lawyer. I had no idea what that really meant, just that they seemed as far away from the portrayals of disability that I'd seen. In all of his wisdom, the counsellor told me that my marks weren't good enough and I should aim for something more realistic. Now, just this week, I was asked to list the communities I belong to and to put down common traits within them. I put down the disability community. And while it's difficult and sometimes dangerous to generalize, I wrote down one word: stubborn. People with disabilities so often develop a skill of being told they can't do something, then doing it anyway. In some way, this is a survival mechanism. And it's with this stubbornness that, despite everything that I'd seen, I decided I was going to prove that careers counsellor wrong. I did nothing but study for the next 3 years and eventually found myself moving to the city and studying politics, philosophy, and yes, law at Monash University. But then it dawned on me that I was completely out of my depth. I'd grown up and I looked something like what you see on the screen, although this is much more recently. And I think it's important. This was me at Phillip Island Festival of Stories a few weeks ago. And this is not something that I would have done when I was younger. But when they get you to speak in live events, they often get you behind a podium. But podiums don't work for me. You wouldn't see anything of me. And I think it is really important for me in these events to say, if we were in person, this is what you'd be seeing, because this is what everyone else around me sees. And I don't like to hide behind a podium. And I also feel uncomfortable now hiding behind the online platform, because I'm really proud of this. I'm really proud of who I am. When I was at uni, my fellow students had done clerkships over the summer. They knew the names of the big firms. Many of their parents were lawyers. They kept asking what school I'd gone to and turning their noses up at my answer of a public school that they'd never heard of. And they either had jobs or they didn't need to because they still lived at home with everything they'd ever want. So I decided to get a uni job. I knew my limitations. I can't stand for hours on end because of the pain in my joints. And that ruled out most entry-level jobs like shelf stacking, hospo, manual labor. I sat down and listed the things that I liked. I was good with numbers. I could tutor. I loved music. I updated the CV I'd created in high school and started delivering it to local businesses. Quite often, the receptionist would peek over their desk, look me up and down, and thank me politely, saying they'd pass it on. I assumed, probably correctly, that there are all sorts of thoughts going on in their heads, informed by the same sorts of representations I'd grown up on of Oompa Loompas and Mini-Me. I decided to send in resumes and cold call, avoiding first impressions. My dream job was to work in a record store. I called the dude and we chatted about music. He seemed interested and asked me to come in. But when I went into the record store, he looked at me, then looked at the shelf, then back at me. How would you reach the top shelf, he asked. Now, the reality is that it could have been a really simple adjustment like a ladder or a stool. But I was stubborn and I said I could climb. It's what I did at the supermarket. I'm sure I could do it at work as well. He smiled and he said he'd call me if anything came up. He never did. Things started to go downhill. I moved from house to house, paying most of my Centrelink on rent. My uni marks started going down. My physical health suffered. My mental health was terrible. My relationships with friends and family suffered. And as is the way with these cycles, my employability in all likelihood went to rock bottom. We don't suffer from disability, but we do suffer the impacts of discrimination. I started putting myself in dangerous situations, like being the object of drunken ridicule at a Melbourne Cup after party, paid the measly sum of $50 cash. I was what I had seen on my TV as a kid. Then one day, the owner of a security company said he wanted me to work for him. It came as a surprise to just about everyone involved. In hindsight, the conditions weren't ideal. The hours were long and the pay was awful, probably unlawful. This is not the part that I recommend today, but it did give me a foot onto the employment highway. The money and meaning that followed allowed me the space to eat well, exercise, study, and I even got to volunteer at my local community radio station. I found a voice. The radio station offered me a job as a trainer, and I moved on from security. I taught people from all walks of life, school groups and adults, people with disabilities and without, to find their own voice. And the opportunities started to present themselves in an avalanche. A friend offered to introduce me to the manager at a commercial radio station, and I worked alongside some of the people who I'd seen on my TV screen as a kid. They'd been the characters who I could never be back then, but suddenly they seemed within reach. I started writing about my own experiences. I finished law. I moved over to the ABC. And every day when I was at the ABC, the wheels of Stella Young would come from behind me. We worked on the same floor. And she wasn't there to talk to the famous people around us, but she was there to talk to me. And she'd ask things like, what are you going to write for me this week? Again, I was getting a voice. I was approached to work for a politician, and suddenly I was sitting in an office in Parliament House in Canberra, where the decisions are made about our lives. But I was part of the decision-making process. After a few years, I decided it was time to put my degree to use, and I became a discrimination lawyer. And now I get to work every day trying to make sure we live in a fairer society, pushing for policy reform and sharing my story, including the release of my first book this year, my small part of trying to shift representations away from voiceless, powerless characters to nuanced, flawed, valued members of our society. Here's me with my 3-year-old daughter in our backyard. And it makes me quite emotional looking at that photo and talking about this journey, because she wouldn't exist if that first person in the security firm hadn't offered me my job. Employment's so much about meaning in life, and this gives me meaning. And this is what it's like for me to meet people. This is me, and people come with their assumptions. I'm meeting here with the Minister for Social Services, Amanda Rishworth, and those offers of employment and my employment journey have led me to be able to have that opportunity to talk to decision makers about the things that impact all of us. And they still come with their prejudices, but we're trying to shift that. It's just a summary of my journey. And the thing about journeys is that we're all still on it. And along my journey, I've come across the full range of reactions to my existence. I just want to stop sharing there and do something that I would do in person, I think. But we've sort of lost the ability to do it. And so I'm going to share my screen to hopefully look at, create a whiteboard. Because I think one thing that, and hopefully you can see this when I press share, but one thing that helps me visualize this is to see our reactions to disability along a spectrum, along a line. And hopefully I can start typing or at least bring a line over this way. And at one end of the line, we have the reactions to us, where people are denying disability. And this happens all the time, and we see it in things like people saying, I don't see you as disabled. We see it in people saying, you're just differently abled. And I think that's really dangerous. And I've only come recently to see that possibly some of my former employers have had this view. And they would quite often say, I don't think you have a disability. And that's not the way I see you. But when we do that, we see failure to make adjustments that are needed to be our best. We see people just thinking that everybody's the same and not embracing this difference. And at the other end of the scale, we have this disability prejudice. And this is where people play into tropes. They see me, for example, as that exploited workforce of the Oompa Loompas or mini-me. And again, it's really dangerous. And what I want to see people start to do, and I think what we're working really hard to find the middle ground here, is to start seeing disability confidence. And this is where we're embracing disability. It's where we're saying, this is who I am. I do need adjustments to do my best. But actually, you're going to get more out of me by doing that. And I'm going to bring a perspective that you don't otherwise have in your job because you're hiring the same sorts of people. And that trait of stubbornness that got me to where I am, that's going to be really valuable in your workplace. So this idea of disability confidence is central to everything that I want to share today. I'm going to spend the rest of my time and we'll go to questions, but going through some ways that I think people with disabilities, and in particular young people with disabilities, can move forward and try and get that job that they love. But also for employers, I think this is the most important thing, for employers to be making plans to employ more people with disabilities in jobs that they love, without discrimination. And so I want to start first talking to young people with disabilities. And hopefully you can go back to my PowerPoint here. Now, the first thing is to embrace your disability. Don't work against it. You've developed skills and traits because of your disability that are going to set you apart from other potential employees. And as I said, one of those for me is stubbornness, but you're going to have your own. Follow your passions. It seems like a privileged thing to say to someone looking for a job. Sometimes you'll just take anything that you can get. But following your passions doesn't have to mean you're following things like human rights or media or politics. One of my dream jobs is still to be a lollipop man. It's my retirement plan. I'd get to chat to my community. I'd see people mature, and I'd make someone's day easier. This can be simple as writing down something like, I like meeting people, so these are some jobs that will make that happen. Or, I don't like meeting people, so here are some jobs that I don't have to do that. Or something like, I like books or music or computers. One of the most talented people I've ever met, she also happens to have a disability, works at a supermarket checkout and has done for years. She's a celebrity within her community because she loves her job. She brings something new to it, and she makes people happy at the register. She could probably do anything that she wanted, but she's really happy being at the checkout. The worst thing that you can do is get a job that you don't want to do. It's going to show, and you're not going to be at your best. The next thing is that you have every right to have that job. I still have this problem. It particularly arises if I have a question and feel silly to ask it. I feel like it will show everyone that I shouldn't be here. But I can guarantee you, everyone else in that room is feeling the same. You have the right to have that job. And this is the thing that employers wince when I say this, but it's one that I wish I'd known when I was just starting out. And it's that right now, most of the jobs you want don't come from applications. It doesn't fit with and I feel like this realization doesn't fit with the Australian view of a fair go. But it's the reality from my journey that the only jobs I've ever received from an application process have been public sector jobs. In the private sector, every single role has come from having a conversation, creating a position, or a tap on the shoulder. And maybe a big part of this reason is because of discriminatory employment practices. But another part is because that's the way things get done in the private sector. It's unfortunate that it is who you know, including family. And this makes it harder for most people, including myself, to get a foot in. What I do say is that it doesn't have to be this way. We have employers on this call who have the ability to change things. If a person with a disability approaches you for a job, ask what they want to do and what do they need to do that job, including adjustments. And most importantly, create non-discriminatory employment practices so the onus isn't on people with disabilities to go up to you asking for jobs in the first place. But I know at this point that employers are wanting to know, well, how do I do this? And there are some important tips that I'll share with you before we go into some questions. The first thing, and I think this is a really important point, is this isn't about an act of charity. And it's not about you being a savior. I've only realized recently, as I said, that some of my employers, and perhaps it was only in the back of their minds, but they signed me up in some sort of complex they have about being a savior. They might like to support special charities or something like that. But to quote Stella Young again, quite often special means shit. It worked for me at the time, but it was actually harmful in the long run. What they had was the soft bigotry of low expectations, and it meant that I didn't perform at my best. When you come from a position of charity, you're setting the process up to entrench discrimination and not to lessen it. We want to do this because people with disabilities are going to have new perspectives and bring new things to these jobs that you don't otherwise have. Right now in the US, Microsoft is pouring billions of dollars into disability accessibility software. And they're getting people with disabilities to lead the work. This is not out of the goodness of their heart, although that's probably what they'll tell you. It's because they've recognized that accessible technology leads to increased business opportunities and better products for everyone. You just have to look at captioning software that so many of us now use every day to see that. So this first tip is to step back from your savior complex. My second broad suggestion is that equal opportunity is just not going to cut it. There's a reason that my job applications were rejected time after time. I had the opportunity to put those job applications in, but when it came down to it, entrenched biases took hold. This is a proactive project, which I think you already know because you're here already. But we have to move on from this notion that we have in Australia that equal opportunity is a good thing, when all it is doing is entrenching existing disadvantage. We have to be proactive. The next tip is to search out different communities. If all your disabled employees are white, you're probably not searching hard enough to find diversity. Advertise for positions in a range of places, in a range of communities, and you're going to get the biggest benefit of diversifying your workforce. Generalizing about people with disabilities is something I hear time after time from people with disabilities. An autistic person might hear a lot, you must be good with numbers, but they might actually hate numbers and they might want to do something artistic instead. For people with disabilities, don't listen to those assumptions. Go back to following your passions. And for employers, don't make those assumptions in the first place. Actually ask, what are your passions and what are your values? What job do you want to do? On a related note, don't make us ask for adjustments. There needs to be serious processes in place once someone is employed to make the adjustments needed for us to do our jobs to the best of our abilities. Ask every new starter. Most disabilities are invisible. What do you need for us to get the best out of you to do this job? The disability wage gap is a thing. A lot of employers target the gender wage gap, which is also really, really important. but you've probably heard the stat that the unemployment rate for people with disability is about double the rest of the population. When we are employed, we're paid about half as much. Your disability data shouldn't stop at percentage of workforce. Measure the disability wage gap and fix it. And then this includes pathways for managerial roles and promotions. And finally, my last tip is that if you've done it tough yourself, don't think that other people should have to as well. I started today talking about my journey. It's a journey we're all on. I think there have been really good parts of my journey and really tough parts of my journey. And I have to check myself every day to make sure that I'm making sure that the people I'm working with and the people who I'm trying to reduce the discrimination against don't have to follow my path, and that there are new pathways added. One thing to know is that everything here will change. We're all learning. Language will change. Best practice will change. Some of the things I've said today will date and possibly already have. But for all of us, this is about lifelong learning. My hope is that you've learned something from today. But if there's one thing I've found, the best lessons come from people younger than you. So I'm also looking forward to taking any questions. And I think I'm going to throw back to Jess there to start the questioning of me.
Jess speaking. Thank you so much, Sam. I wanted to jump off something you said in your advice to young people looking for work, when you said that, sometimes you feel silly asking a question. Because we're going into our Q&A section, there are no silly questions. Please ask away. Sam said he's an open book, so go for it. I'm going to start us off with a question, and then I'll go to some audience questions. So I wanted to start by asking Sam about your autobiography, Broke. So that was published in June this year. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was there a particular moment, conversation, or reason that you decided to write it? And how was your experience writing your first book?
Yeah, it was actually a race between me and my brother to write it. So my brother's 4 years younger than me. He lives in London. He's a teacher, and he doesn't have a visible disability. But we talked about it previously, and he's studied writing, so he was more qualified than me to do it, but seemed too busy. So it actually started with a conversation with my mum. The book is not just about disability, but it's also about growing up with a disability in a single parent family, and really relying on a lot of public safeguards like public education, health, welfare, to I guess break a cycle and break the likely outcome that some generations are worse off than the ones before. And so I interviewed my mum for hours and hours, all about her life. I've still got it on tape. And I thought, and I was considering a book about me, but actually by talking to her, I actually realized that I needed to write a book about my mum. And So the book's by me, but it is about my mother. It was it was a slog, I think, particularly as a parent. And I took 18 months parental leave to look after my daughter. I work part-time now so that I make sure that I spend a lot of time with her. So the book was written over a year, every night after bedtime, after 8 p.m. And I just made sure I had a target every day of writing 400 or 500 words, and that it would get done. And by the end, I'd have to write 1,000 words and then review 5,000 words, and got to the deadline, and then the deadline passed. But now that it's out there, it feels like it's not my story. It feels like it's the community's story. And people really, I think, are seeing parts of themselves in the book, because it's not going to tell you what to think or what a solution to some of these issues are. It's just really putting yourself in my shoes and my family's shoes and saying, this is what it felt like, or smelt like, or sounded like to be in this position. And then people are taking different things from that. We actually know a lot of the solutions to these problems. We just need the will to do that. And it's the same goes for employment. We saw drastic action on a casualised workforce, on reasonable, on workplace adjustments, on things like working from home during the pandemic and lockdowns. We had the political will to do that, and we just have to make sure that we can pressure our governments to have the will to make these adjustments and make these legislative changes, so that employers are implementing that in practice when it's not a pandemic and we're not in lockdown.
Just speaking. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing all of that. All right, let's go to some audience questions. The first one from Simon. When working towards that dream job, like you mentioned with security, there may often be those not quite right, but a good start jobs. What would you say to young disabled people who are facing those not quite right jobs? And how could they make sure the not quite right isn't on the wrong side of exploitative? How can they determine that personal balance?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I feel like, to an extent, I experienced exactly that. I worked really, really long hours. I was paid at a very low rate without any loading for doing night shift or weekends or those long hours. Like sometimes I'd do a 20-hour shift, and it just felt like that's what you needed to do. I think everyone in that industry was experiencing the same, and we were just taking what we could get. But it was particularly difficult for having a disability, and you're particularly susceptible to accepting that. And I think it was really about having a plan for the next step, and to know your rights. Like at that point, there were discriminatory practices going on, and I won't go into what they were, but looking back at it now as a discrimination and human rights lawyer, there should have been legal complaints made, and there just weren't. And there was a workforce, a high proportion of migrants working in that workforce who were probably afraid to exercise those rights. So if you feel like you are not reaching that balance, and it is the wrong side of it, exploitative, as you say, do feel free to pick up the phone. There are services there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a legal service, but you know, a service like CIDR or other services out there, and they're free. You know, there are free legal services where you can just say, all right, well, these are my rights, and to know that just for accessing that information, there can't be any what's called victimization. So an employer can't act to your detriment for getting legal advice or bringing a legal action against them. I think at the same time, there's this reality there of you want to be happy in your job. And if you're not happy, then to try and work out that plan. What are the next steps to get where I want to get? And to ask for support. And it might be an organization, or it might just be friends or family. It might be, you know, someone like me, who you're all welcome to get in touch and just get some one-on-one advice, because it's going to differ from situation to situation as well.
Jess speaking. Yes, it took me 4 jobs to find a workplace that really listened to what I needed. So yeah, I can definitely relate there to a lot of things you said. Awesome. The next question that I wanted to go to is from Gina. Have you had any interaction with schools about offering work experience to all students in the community, not grouping students with disability together or not offering it to them all?
Yeah, so I haven't at my school. I mean, I went to a pretty small school, and the work experience that they organized for us was very local. And we didn't, I mean, disability wasn't something that was talked about at my school, particularly back then. I think hopefully things have changed now. But we have an opportunity, I think, with schools after the Royal Commission to make generational change. And we have half the commissioners saying that the segregated school system needs to end, and all of the commissioners saying we need to phase this out as much as possible. Now, it doesn't really, in Victoria, the Victorian government's just promised to build 13 new specialist schools. This is about a political will thing. And I think it's going to take the community's real effort to push to try and end all segregated settings, including work experience. So schools, I think, I'm sorry to keep coming back to a legal perspective, but I haven't had experience with a school saying that the students with disability shouldn't have work experience. I absolutely think that they should, and I think it's probably unlawful for them not to be. So if that's happening, I'd be kicking up a fuss. And again, you can contact me out of session if it's happening, because I can direct you to services. It just shouldn't be happening. But I would make on that point with education post Royal Commission, that now is the time for us to be ending any sort of gatekeeping practice, any sort of restraint and seclusion practice, and really targeting the exclusionary practices of expulsion and suspension, because they are, by and large, being practiced against people with disabilities. And now is the time to make sure our governments and schools are working together to end those practices.
Jess speaking. Thank you so much. And don't apologise for your legal perspective. It's one of the reasons you're here.
Yeah, but it can be so boring.
I don't think so. So the next question I wanted to ask is from Belle. Also noting we've got 5 minutes of questions left. Belle said, I loved what you said about equal opportunity versus equity in job opportunities. I see many disability support organisations and service providers are run by people who aren't disabled, and they don't seem to have any interest in hiring or listening to disabled people, even those they are supposed to be supporting. Do you have any suggestions for convincing a disability organisation to hire more disabled people and thus improve their services? Or should we just create our own disability org where people with disability are at the centre and have a voice?
I love the last suggestion, because I think it will put the former out of business. This is, from a market-based perspective, if you're putting people with disability at the centre, you're going to have better outcomes. And so, if you're fed up with it, I think sometimes it is a good idea to do it yourself, but it probably shouldn't have to be that way. Where I guess if there is an organisation that is not hiring any people with disabilities, then practical things that they can do are, I mean, it's a choice, right? And I'm not saying that any choice is better than the other, but as a sort of last resort thing, quotas are needed in those sort of organisations, but it shouldn't need to get that far. If you've got non-discriminatory practices and you're a disability based organisation, you should be a disability-led organisation. And that goes all the way to their management and their boards. And once we start getting on management and boards, then the cycle should fix itself and we will be hiring more people with disabilities. Yeah, I reiterate that hiring people with disabilities doesn't stop at just a percentage. It needs to be all the way up the organisation, and we need to be paid correctly for the work that we're doing. And once an organisation realises this, they're going to offer better services to their clients.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, I do want to ask this last question. We'll make it a quick one. So special welcome to Kahembo, who is here from Uganda. So Kahembo has said, I really resonated with your journey. I'd love to hear your advice for disabled youth in Africa, like myself, who are facing challenges entering the job market. Despite our dedication to education, finding employment remains a significant hurdle. Personally, I've earned a diploma in computer science, but the economic conditions aren't providing enough motivation to pursue my bachelor's degree. Any insights or guidance would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, that's great to have, Kahembo. Thanks for joining. I've never been to Uganda, so I'm not, I don't have the knowledge to make my advice specific. One thing I would say is that there seems to be a trap. And I'm going to come up with a real catchphrase one day, but at the moment I'm just going to explain it, is that people with disabilities, because we are discriminated in the workplace, we ended up, there's a lot of people with disabilities who end up doing a perpetual cycle of education. And so you have this overeducated class of people with disabilities who might have 2 or 3 degrees and a postgrad, and they're applying for jobs that are well below them, but still the discrimination continues. I'm not sure, apart from having a legal framework that addresses the discrimination at the job application stage, and making sure that your employers are valuing the benefits of disability within the workplace, then we're not going to fix this problem. It's also really hard at the moment because it might be the same in Uganda, but certainly in Australia, the rents are going up. Everything at the supermarket's going up. It's not enough. Any payments that we're getting for being a student is not enough to cover that. And so there needs to be a circuit breaker. And it really, I think we need some champions of change. And I think that's some organizations, I mean, that's why we're here today, to gather around and come up with these solutions to value that diversity and get more people with disabilities in the workplace, so that bosses can say, hey, that was a really good move. Let's do more like that. I think in those situations, it goes back to that really unfortunate position where where discrimination exists, job applications aren't working for people with disabilities. And so in a situation where you've got your diploma of computer science, no one's hiring you, then we need to create a situation where it's not just up to the person with a disability to go and create a job for themselves. But at the moment, that's what we have to do. And it goes back to that question about people or creating disability-led organizations. Sometimes that's not happening right now in the market, but we might just have to do it ourselves. And that's a really hard reality.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering that one, Sam. Okay, I'm going to do a quick wrap up. Thank you again, Sam, for speaking with us today, sharing your journey, and also so many practical tips. Much appreciated. Thank you also to everyone who attended today and asked questions. It's been wonderful having you here. Remember, Sam's book, Broke, is out now. But with that, I will wrap up today's Spotlight series. Thank you again, Sam.
Thanks for having me.